Hello, before I get into the main bulk of the article, I just wanted to jump on here and remind you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and if you're needing any help in your health journey, you can go to my new website, MissouriHealthCoach.com, and set up a free 15-minute consultation. You'll find the link to that website in the description of this video. You'll also find a couple of links to a couple of different companies like Health Natura, who are making high quality supplements like aspirin and vitamin K2, and you can use my code to get up to 20% off of some of these high quality supplements. So I encourage you to check out the description of this video. Okay, enjoy listening to this article by Dr. Peat. Hello again, Jared Pitts here, and today I'm going to be reading another article by Dr. Ray Peat. This one is called Aging, Estrogen, and Progesterone. This is how it goes. Quote-unquote estrogen refers not just to a family of steroids, but to a class of substances that can produce approximately the same effects as estradiol and its metabolites. Even before the pure substance was isolated in the 1930s, the effects of fluid from ovarian follicles were studied. It was soon discovered that many chemicals could produce similar effects. By the middle of the century, many toxic effects of the estrogens were known, and more are being discovered. Cancer, abnormal blood clotting, and infertility were known to be caused by estrogen before 1940. But at the same time, the drug companies began calling estrogen the quote-unquote female hormone, and claiming that it would improve fertility. Since the 19th century, some people argued that aging was caused by hormonal deficiency. For example, the symptoms of thyroid deficiency resembled aging. The estrogen industry exploited this idea to create the quote-unquote hormone replacement business. Some hormones do decrease with aging, but others increase. All of the unpleasant consequences of estrogen excess happen to resemble some of the events of aging. If aging involves the same processes that are created by estrogen, then our knowledge of how to protect ourselves against estrogen can be used to protect ourselves against aging. Estrogen steals oxygen from mitochondria, shifting patterns of growth and adaptation. Okay, that was just several excerpts right there, and now we're going to get into the main bulk of the article. The balance between what a tissue needs and what it gets will govern the way that tissue functions, in both the short term and the long term. When a cell emits lactic acid and free radicals and the products of lipid peroxidation, it's reasonable to assume that it isn't getting everything that it needs, such as oxygen and glucose. Okay, just real quick summary there, because we're already hitting it hard. So, like it says, a cell emitting lactic acid, why is that grouped in with free radicals, lipid peroxidation, right? When you're working out, you can't utilize oxygen as you should. You've run out of energy, essentially. You start producing energy in a different way that instead of going through oxidative phosphorylation and producing carbon dioxide and ATP, right? It produces lactic acid. Okay, continuing on. With time, the cell will either die or adapt in some ways to its deprived conditions. Okay, and it's deprived. You know that it's deprived of oxygen if it's producing lactic acid, because without oxygen, it can't go through the regular energy creation process, oxidative phosphorylation. It has to go through the backup mechanism or these emergency mechanisms, and when it does that, it creates these toxic byproducts, such as lactic acid. In aging, tissues generally atrophy with loss of both substance and activity. Ordinarily, organisms react to stress with increased activity of the appropriate functional system. But when the stress is inescapable, organisms adopt the strategy of decreasing their demands, as in hibernation or the defensive inhibition that has been called parabiosis, the state of being quote-unquote not fully alive. In many situations, serotonin, which is closely associated with estrogen, seems to be an important inducer of this state. There are many indications that estrogen is a factor, and there are some studies referenced there, in functionally suppressed states such as hibernation, social subordination, learned helplessness, and depression. Social subordination in animals often involves high estrogen and reduced fertility. In good health, an animal's systems are designed so that certain tissues will be intensely but briefly stimulated by estrogen, and the emphasis there being on briefly. This stimulation by estrogen doesn't produce the normal amount of carbon dioxide, so the tissue experiences oxygen deprivation, leading to swelling and cell division. Along with reduced carbon dioxide production, there is increased lipid peroxidation. Any similar stimulation, whether it's produced by soot or suffocation or irradiation, will produce the broad range of estrogen's effects, beginning with inflammation but ending with atrophy or cancer if it is too prolonged. And I've probably said it too many times as I'm reading through his articles, but it's this idea that as you have these stress responses, they're built in. We're designed so that we have these stress responses, but they weren't meant to be chronic, right? These are acute situations that we should be experiencing the stress response for. Not chronic, and most people are experiencing the stress response in a chronic way, whether that's environmental toxins, nutritionally, or just the barrage of pharmaceuticals that people are taking to band-aid whatever problem they think they're band-aiding as they just roll this snowball that's gathering strength and mass, down the hill of life, if you will. All right, moving on. Although as the 21st century begins, the U.S. government hasn't decided whether to classify estrogen as a carcinogen. I can't imagine that there are few dollars being attributed to that, or helping that not get classified, right? It was identified as a carcinogen in the first half of the 20th century, and a variety of carcinogens were found to be estrogenic. Many people studying estrogen's biological effects observed that certain of its effects resembled the changes seen in aging, such as fibrotic changes of connective tissues, accelerated accumulation of age pigment, a tendency to miscarry, or the production of degenerative changes in various organs. But as far as I know, I was the first one to suggest that aging itself involves increased estrogen dominance. Taking this perspective suggests many specific things to do for aging. And if radiation injury and stress are quote-unquote estrogenic, it suggests that specific anti-estrogenic treatments could be appropriate. And this idea of estrogen dominance, right? Meaning that, okay, we have estrogen. It is a hormone in our bodies, and it has a purpose. But when you have this ratio of, let's say, for example, estrogen to progesterone, and you're having more estrogen to progesterone as a ratio, right, then you can have what's called estrogen dominance. Okay, it's not saying that, you don't have progesterone or, and it could be at certain times of someone's cycle where estrogen increases and maybe progesterone does not increase as it should. So there's many ways that people will experience the effects and the symptoms of estrogen dominance, right? Okay. I based my argument on the identity of the biochemical and tissue effects produced by aging and by estrogenic excess. At that time, techniques for the accurate measurement of very small amounts of estrogen hadn't been fully developed. I felt that the situation should have been clear because of the previous decades of research, and I used that as the context for arguing that the reason for age-related infertility was the same as for estrogen-induced infertility, or stress-related infertility, namely the inability to deliver oxygen to the embryo. I thought of the developing embryo as a sensitive indicator of processes that occur throughout the body during aging and stress, and that the destruction of the embryo by the excessive estrogen of the birth control pill was closely analogous to the progressive loss of function that occurs in so many tissues during normal aging. After I wrote my dissertation, Terry Parkening, who had worked in the same lab, sent me data from rats showing that his measurements confirmed the increase of estrogen with aging. Since then, many others have shown that either the absolute levels of estrogen or the ratio of estrogen to the anti-estrogens increases with aging in a wide variety of organisms of both sexes, including humans. In the 1970s, the claims about estrogen curing osteoporosis apparently had been debunked. At the time, that appeared to be the last of the major claims for the therapeutic properties of estrogen. Studies in dogs were starting to show that estrogen was an important cause of degenerative bone disease, as well as kidney disease, liver disease, thyroid disease, etc. Hormones used in contraceptives were producing cancer in dogs as well as many other diseases. So dog research was widely abandoned by the drug industry/FDA in favor of animals that were less sensitive or differently sensitive to the hormones. The claims that the industry was making were contradicted by the dog research, so they sought new animal quote-unquote models that wouldn't so clearly contradict their claims. A great advantage for the drug industry of using rats instead of dogs is that expensive and often embarrassing long-term experiments aren't possible in such short-lived animals. Rats die when their tissues still appear to be relatively young, although excess prolactin, resulting from excess estrogen in humans, is an important cause of osteoporosis. In rats at a certain age and on a certain diet, hyperprolactinemia can stimulate bone growth. And there's a study there. 2 studies. This trait of rats could be very advantageous to the estrogen industry. Okay, so, and if you didn't get that, right, as our, human estrogen goes up, so does our prolactin, right? And vice versa. Whereas, and this causes osteoporosis, right? Whereas in rats, hyperprolactinemia, okay, so if they have excess estrogen and it's causing higher prolactin, this can actually stimulate bone growth in a rat, okay? So if it's doing the opposite as far as bone growth and bone health in a rat, then not a good model to say, hey, let's use estrogen to build bone in humans, right? All right, moving on. All of the maladies caused by estrogen excess appear to develop in the same way that it interferes with pregnancy, by driving the tissue to require more energy and oxygen than can be delivered to it. Necrosis, the death of sections of tissue, was produced acutely by extreme overdoses of estrogen, or gradually by less extreme overdoses, and if the estrogenic stimulation was milder but very prolonged, the result would usually be tumors, sometimes developing in the midst of atrophy or necrosis. An overdose of estrogen was used to shrink breasts and prevent lactation, and an even larger dose was used to kill breast tissue in treating cancer. A recent study, and this is in bold, so an important sentence here, and there's the study reference there from 2000, shows that at least in women, estrogen is closely associated with the general loss of fat-free tissue with aging. This shows a close association between the generalized atrophy of aging and the amount of estrogen in the tissues. In the case of the embryo that can't implant in the aged or estrogenized uterus, it is because oxygen is being consumed so fast by the uterus that very little is available for the embryo. The uterus is, effectively, in an inflamed state, and the embryo is in a state that requires abundant oxygen. The general loss of tissue that Toth, which is the study we referenced just above, associated with increased estrogen follows many of the same steps that occur in the failure of the embryo to implant in the uterus. Glycogen is depleted in futile oxidative cycles, protein synthesis is inhibited, lipid peroxides and free radicals accumulate, cellular defensive and repair processes replace normal functioning. Okay, so we're seeing all of these things in both of those cases. Increased estrogen and with failure of the embryo to implant in a uterus. With aging, the loss of glycogen in the brain has serious consequences, including insomnia. Estrogen's depletion of glycogen in other tissues is probably important for their functioning, and thyroid and progesterone are known to help maintain the glycogen stores. In the last several years, according to the medical literature, estrogen would seem to have outgrown nearly all of its bad traits. It protects the brain, the heart, the blood vessels, even the fetus, and it prevents many kinds of cancer and improves memory, mood, and immunity. And it would still seem to be of great promise in treating breast cancer and prostate cancer if we took some medical journals seriously. Ha ha ha. Can you hear his sarcasm? It achieves many of these nice things by functioning as an antioxidant and by increasing circulation, often acting through nitric oxide and serotonin or melatonin. Even though I have read thousands of the articles that said otherwise, the near unanimity of the current research literature can almost give me the feeling that things might not be exactly as they had seemed. In fact, they aren't, but the change is in what passes for science, rather than in the way organisms respond to estrogen. Many little pictures are being presented that seem to add up to a very different big picture. It is clear that this new picture is being painted by those who fund the research, and by some of those whose careers depend on that funding. The people who do the odd little studies of estrogen and cytokines, nitric oxide, regulatory genes, and so on are usually getting the data they claim to get, and if they draw speculative conclusions about what their study means medically, that's their privilege. But hundreds of these little publications that would be harmless individually add up to a national policy endorsed by the FDA and other powerful agencies. They add up to the same sort of criminal conspiracy that the tobacco industry and its researchers perpetuated throughout the 20th century. Journals that are considered to be the best in their field publish many papers that simply misrepresent some of the basic facts, while interpreting experimental results that would otherwise have unpleasant commercial implications. For example, the follicular phase is a time of low steroid production by the ovary, until near the end of the phase just before ovulation when estrogen rises. The luteal phase is a time of high estrogen and high progesterone synthesis. Many publications describe the follicular phase as a time of high estrogen and the luteal phase as a time of low estrogen, roughly the opposite of the actual situation. And an even larger number of studies get the results they want by using a short exposure to estrogen to study something which takes a long time to develop. In the last few years, one of the most common tricks of estrogen promotion is to argue that estrogen protects against heart disease and Alzheimer's disease because it relaxes blood vessels by increasing the formation of nitric oxide. It does generally increase the formation of nitric oxide, but nitric oxide is a toxic free radical that plays a major role in degenerative diseases, and the inappropriate relaxation of blood vessels, coupled with increased clotability of the blood, is a major cause of pulmonary embolisms and venous disorders. And so this is how it always happens, They build up this thing like nitric oxide as being some type of health elixir, and then they can associate anything they want with it when it's actually a marker of disease, right? And they can say all these other things by association are healthy, right? And so they've done the same thing with, fish oils and all kinds of things. And, just looking at the fish oil market, holy cow, in regards to making money, that's where it's at, right? Alas. Here we go. In studies of tendons, excess estrogen, aging, and cooking, the phenomenon of the curling pork chop all caused hardening and contraction of the collagen. When people get to be 90 or 100 years old, the opening between their eyelids is sometimes contracted, presumably because of this process of collagen shrinkage. If this shrinkage of connective tissue affects the large blood vessels, they become narrower and stiffer, so that the blood has to travel faster if the same amount is to be delivered in the same time. Ultrasound can be used to measure the velocity of the blood flow, and increased velocity will correspond to constriction of the channel, if the same amount of blood is being delivered. But many people praise estrogen's vascular benefits on the basis of tests showing increased blood velocity in large arteries such as the aorta, without evidence that more blood is being circulated. With aging, as arteries become constricted, increased blood velocity is taken as evidence of the pathology. Velocity measurements have to be interpreted in the context of tissue perfusion, cardiac output, etc. When the diameter of the artery is considered along with the velocity of the blood, the volume of flow can be determined, and then it appears that progesterone increases blood flow while estrogen can decrease it, and that's from a study. This would be consistent with the known ability of an estrogen excess to cause retarded growth of the fetus, as well as specific birth defects. And this next sentence is in bold. Estrogen does increase the blood flow to particular organs, but apparently less than it increases their oxygen demand, as can be seen from the color change of estrogenized tissues, toward purple rather than pink. Measurements of oxygen tension in the tissues show that estrogen decreases the relative availability of oxygen, and when the level of estrogen is very high, metabolically demanding tissues such as the kidney and adrenal cortex simply die, especially under conditions that restrict blood flow, and there are several studies there. When estrogen's effects overlap with the stimulating effects of other hormones, such as pituitary hormones, particular organs undergo something similar to quote-unquote excitotoxicity. When estrogen overlaps with endotoxin, as it tends to do, multiple organ failure is the result. The simple need for more oxygen is a stimulus to increase the growth of blood vessels. An estrogen stimulation of non-mitochondrial oxygen consumption with the production of lactic acid stimulates blood vessel formation. Progesterone, by increasing oxidative efficiency, opposes this angiogenic or neovascularization effects of estrogen. And you might get into this in this article, I'm not sure, but this is the same with what I can't remember the name of the drug that is called Rogaine. Rogaine, yep, I think that's how you pronounce it. That is stimulating this hair growth, right? It's forcing this, estrogenic effect in this particular area. And so I know so many people taking, using Rogaine to stimulate hair growth, and they don't understand that they're essentially forcing that part of their body to go through what one might call the C word metabolism, okay? And they're forcing that onto their body so that they can have more hair, right? All right. Szent-Györgyi spent most of his career studying muscles, from the anal sphincter to pigeon breast to tense goats. One of his most interesting experiments investigated the effects of estrogen and progesterone on the heart muscle. He showed that estrogen excess prevents the increase of stroke volume as the speed increases, but that progesterone increases the stroke volume as the heart accelerates, making pumping more effective without unnecessary acceleration of the heart rate. These effects are parallel to Cellular's observation that estrogen imitates the shock reaction. In shock, the blood pressure decreases, mainly because the blood volume decreases. Water is taken up by the tissues out of the blood. Much of the remaining blood volume is accumulated in the relaxed veins, and little is returned to the heart. Yet the increased need for circulation accelerates the heart, causing each stroke to pump only a small amount. The reduced blood pressure caused many people to think that adrenaline would help to improve the circulation. But actually, the quote-unquote resistance arteries, small arteries that provide blood to the arterioles and capillaries, are constricted in shock. And that's from a study by Lin et al. 1998. And adrenaline usually makes the situation worse. When tissue is poorly oxygenated or is exposed to estrogen, it takes up water, swelling and becoming more rigid, turgid. It also takes up calcium, especially under the influence of estrogen, causing muscles to contract. This swelling effect will be much more noticeable in small arteries than in major arteries with very large channels. But when the effect is prolonged, it will affect even the heart, causing it to quote-unquote stiffen, weakening its ability to pump. There is some evidence that estrogen can make large arteries stiffen over a span of a few months, and that's from a study in 1999. Estrogen, by creating an oxygen deficiency, stimulates first swelling and then collagen synthesis. Collagen tends to accumulate with aging. In shock, the cells are in a very low energy state, and infusions of ATP have been found to be therapeutic. But simple hypertonic solutions of glucose and salt are probably safer and are very effective. The low energy of cells causes them to take up water, but it also causes the veins, which always receive blood after most of its oxygen and nutrients have been extracted, to lose their tone, allowing blood to pool in them instead of returning to the heart. And there's a study. This contributes to varicose veins, in another study, and to orthostatic hypotension, which is seen in women who are exposed to too much estrogen, and very frequently in old people. And orthostatic hypotension is just a lowering of your blood pressure when you stand. The energy failure resulting from estrogen excess has been remarkably well characterized, but the meaning of this for the cell hasn't been explored. The electron transfer process of the mitochondria is interrupted by the futile redox cycling catalyzed by estrogens. Good sleep requires fairly vigorous metabolism and a normal body temperature. In old age, the metabolic rate is decreased and sleep becomes defective. Protein synthesis declines with aging as the metabolic rate slows. At least in the brain, protein synthesis occurs most rapidly in deep sleep, and there's a couple of studies. In old age, the catabolic hormones such as cortisol are relatively dominant. Another study, and even in youth, cortisol rises during darkness, reaching its peak around dawn. Even in young women, bone loss occurs almost entirely during the night, when cortisol is high. The hormones that are commonly said to prevent bone loss, estrogen and growth hormone, are high at night, rising along with cortisol. Estrogen causes growth hormone to increase, and in the morning, young women's growth hormone has been found to be 28 times higher than men's. And there's a study. The growth hormone response to estrogen is probably the result of the changed use of glucose under estrogen's influence, making it necessary to mobilize free fatty acids from tissues. While estrogen is usually highest at night, progesterone is lowest during the night. These observations should suggest that progesterone, not estrogen, is the bone protective substance. The disappearance of water from the blood as it moves into the tissues during the night makes sleep resemble a state of shock or inflammation. Since rats that are active at night experience the same blood thickening, it's actually the darkness rather than sleep that creates this quote-unquote inflammatory state. Estrogen increases and acts through the inflammatory mediators, serotonin and histamine, to increase vascular leakiness at the same time that it causes cell to take up water and calcium. The formation of lactic acid in place of carbon dioxide tends to coordinate these effects. And I think anytime I'm talking to someone about health, sleep is always related. Every time. I was just talking to someone who was talking about and I don't think I had heard of it in this way before, but that they were diagnosed with something called like dawn sickness, right? DAWN, as you're waking up, right, with the sun. And in the same conversation, this person said that sugar was bad, right? And they knew that there was some type of glycogen issue with what they were experiencing, but they still had to say sugar is bad. And this is why you have to get out of your box, the dogma of the quote unquote health world. When allopathy and alternative medicine is screaming the same thing, maybe it's not right. Okay, so everything is forcing this on people. People are saying stop eating after dinner, and you have this massive gap in eating between dinner and breakfast the next morning, and some people are not even eating breakfast and drinking coffee, right? These are I'm not giving advice here. This is what I think you should use this in your own research, but If you're having issues, especially, as you're waking up at the end of the night, right? Sleep or, darkness and a lack of glycogen, your body depleting glycogen and you not having energy for anything, these are stressors. And so find ways to mitigate these stressors. This is what I would do if I was having these issues, right? One thing that I'll do is have something like what we call sugar milk before we go to sleep. We have our, dairy cow that we milk every day, and we'll throw a spoonful of sugar into a glass of milk, and we'll down that before we go to sleep, and we'll sleep like a baby. Because we're giving our body fuel, right, to make it through this stressful time of darkness. Okay, I'm going to get off my soapbox. In sleep, as in shock, hyperventilation is common, and it sometimes produces extreme vasoconstriction because of the loss of carbon dioxide. Since glucose and salt are used to treat shock, intravenous 7.5% salt solutions are effective, it seems appropriate to use carbohydrate, preferably sugar rather than starch, in salty foods during the night to minimize the stress reaction. They lower adrenaline and cortisol and help to maintain the volume and fluidity of blood. Thyroid to maintain adequate carbon dioxide is often all it takes to improve the blood levels of salt, glucose, and adrenaline. Temperature falls during sleep. Recent experiments show that hypothermia during surgery exacerbates the edema produced by stress, and that hypertonic, hyperosmotic, and hyperonchotic solutions alleviate the swelling. It is possible that light's action directly on the cells helps to prevent swelling, and that the body's infrared emissions have a similar function. Whatever the mechanism is, adequate temperature improves sleep, and an excessive nocturnal temperature drop probably increases edema with all of its harmful consequences. At least some of the redox cycles involving NAD and NADH and NADP and NADPH keeps electrons from moving beyond ubiquinone or CoQ10 and energizing the mitochondria. The cycle that makes nitric oxide is one of these, but some forms of estrogen participate directly as catalysts in this energy-stealing process. One of the effects of blocking electron transfer in the mitochondria is to lower the energy charge of the cells, mimicking the function of the age-damaged mitochondria. Glutathione and protein sulfhydryls are oxidized because the normal energy pathways that maintain them have been disrupted. Estrogen directly lowers the temperature while progesterone raises the temperature. Estrogen sets the brain's temperature regulator lower, but acting through serotonin and other mediators, it can actually lower the metabolic rate too. Far from being just the quote-unquote hormone of estrus, estrogen in the form of estradiol and the related steroids plays a role in organisms as diverse as yeasts, worms, and mollusks, and in modifying the function of practically every type of animal cell, skin, nerve, muscle, bone, hair, gland, etc. But as more and more of its functions come to be understood, it turns out that many toxic chemicals and stressful physical processes can activate the same functions, and that estrogen's association with the functions of stress makes it a kind of window into some universal biological functions. When Hans Cellier brought it to our attention that quote-unquote stress was a general life process, he began a process of generalization that led people to be able to see that the changes of aging were also the result of complex interactions between organisms and their environment, rather than some genetic program that operates like a clock running down. And this is another thing that you could read that Dr. Peat has put stuff out on, the whole idea of genes dictating exactly how our life and health is going to run. And it just seems to be this thing that people use to kind of shirk the responsibility. Well, it's genetic. There is always something someone can do, even if genes may play a role in what you're experiencing, because I don't want to discredit that. You are still able to influence that, right? There's a whole field called epigenetics. Why is that? And why do they call it epigenetics if it's this thing that morphs and changes? And Is it because they want these schools and pharmaceutical companies want people to think that they want them to believe in this deterministic viewpoint? And it also helps them be able to give you whatever drug they want to give you. They say, this is your genetic determinant endpoint. Like, there is no getting around this. You have to take this drug, right? It's this 1-to-1 ratio, 1-to-1 relationship thing. But Dr. Peat writes extensively on genetics. So I would I would suggest, not advise, not giving any advice here. Just go and read some of his stuff on genetics. If you are in that box, if you are in a place in your life where you think whatever you're experiencing is completely out of your control, even if it might be, just read what he has to say on genetics, and maybe it'll give you a little glimmer of hope. And again, if there's anything Ray Peat wrote about that is encouraging, it's the power of our mind, the power that we have when we're not in this state of learned helplessness, right? So anyway, I hope that's encouraging, because so many people think that, and if you're just, if people are using it as an excuse to shirk their responsibility, fine. But if you actually believe this, that you are genetically determined to have whatever you have, just try to let it be challenged, okay? Let it be challenged. All right, we're going to finish up this article right here. When W. Donner Denkla, what a name, demonstrated, okay, another D word. When W. Donner Denkla demonstrated that the removal of an animal's pituitary, or in the case of an octopus, its equivalent optic gland, radically extended the animal's lifespan, he proposed the existence of a death hormone in the pituitary gland. But the case of the octopus makes it clear that the catabolic, death-inducing hormone is produced by the ovary under the influence of the optic gland's gonadotropins. This sacrifice of the quote-unquote old, the individual, for the new, the progeny, is analogous to the tissue wasting we see under the influence of estrogen as it stimulates cell division. In Cellier's classical stress, the destruction of tissues by the catabolic hormones makes sense in terms of the quote-unquote functional system described by Anokin, in which the hormones of adaptation dissolve one tissue for use by the system which is adaptively functioning, with the production of carbon dioxide by the functional tissue, stabilizing it and regulating the adequate delivery of blood. Progesterone is both an anti-catabolic hormone and an anti-estrogenic hormone, and in both cases it protects the functional systems from atrophy. The extreme generality of the phenomenon of quote-unquote estrogenicity that was built up during the 20th century has taken the concept beyond the specific functions of estrus and reproduction and the activation of genetic programs of the female animal, to make it necessary to see it as a way that living substances respond to certain kinds of stimulus. And these ways of responding turn out to be involved in the complex but coherent ways that organisms respond to aging. Cellier gave various names to the biology of stress, but the quote-unquote general adaptation syndrome expressed the idea accurately. But the biology of estrogenicity, like the biology of aging, is so central that any name is likely to be misleading. The historical accident of naming a hormone for estrus shouldn't keep us from thinking about the way estrogen affects our energetics and structure, and how those processes relate to aging, atrophy, cancerization, etc. While progesterone is probably the most perfect anti-estrogenic hormone, and therefore an anti-stress and anti-aging hormone, the recognition of a wide variety of estrogen's effects has made it possible to adjust many things in our diet and environment to more perfectly oppose the estrogenic and age-accelerating influences. All right, so too long, didn't read. Summary: estrogen equals aging, progesterone equals anti-aging. As usual, extensive references at the bottom, So feel free to read through those on your own time. I'll leave the link to the article in the description of the video. I hope you like this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel so that you get notified next time I put another video out. Until next time, God bless.